Welcome everyone to this conversation with Wende Marshall and Matt Meyer concerning their new book, Insurrectionary Uprisings. My name is Suren Moodliar. I'm one of the co-producers of Shelter and Solidarity. Joining me in this hosting role today is Yusuf Nuruddin, who serves with me on the board of Socialism and Democracy. Yusuf, do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
I serve on the board of Socialism and Democracy. I'm a Bedford-Stuyvesant native, born and bred here and still live here. I've been involved, I'm 72 years old, okay? So I've been around and been in too many organizations to mention right now. Was at the Breck Forum one time about 10, 12 years ago when I was co-chair of the board. And I've been in the Black Radical Congress and the Black Left Unity Network and a bunch of other organizations. So that's a good enough introduction.
Yeah,
I've also been an adjunct instructor at a million places. I'm still teaching at the University of Toledo.
Okay. Thank you, Yusuf. Yusuf, I'm going to introduce Matt and Wende in a moment. I'll say a little bit about the book really quickly and my reaction to it before we get into a substantive conversation about the book itself. So Wende Marshall was born in New Haven, Connecticut at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. She worked as a community organizer in Central Harlem, New York City during the 1980s and graduated with an MA in Religious Studies from the Union Theological Seminary. In 1999, she received a PhD in anthropology from Princeton University. Her work centers on the study of race and class, medicine, science, and social change. Matt Meyer is a native of New York City, activist, author, and is the War Resisters International Africa Support Network coordinator and a UN ECOSOC representative of the International Peace Research Association. I'll say a bit more about Matt a little later, but my primary way of engaging with Matt, since we have a bit of a personal connection, is that we've been working on the Movements of Movements project together for a while now. Turning to the book itself, I should confess something. The moment somebody hands me a reader, a compilation of essays, I'm almost immediately turned off by it. I wonder, how could this possibly be valuable? And when you open it and you see names that you expect, you think, oh, it's not going to be worth it that much. And yet, to my surprise, and it was a very humbling experience to open this book, confront many names and works that I'm very familiar with, and yet see them in an entirely new light, not only in a new light in terms of what they have to say, but also in the juxtapositioning, the putting together of Gandhi and Fainor, and so on and so on. And so this was a very welcome book for me after actually opening it up. The other reason I found it so valuable is it immediately took me back to the uprising of 2020 and the task that we all have of having to think anew the methods of our methods in light of this radical revolutionary experience at the intersection of resistance, reform, and revolution. And so for me, this is a very valuable book right away. I'd like to, however, turn to Yusuf to get his early impressions of the book. And if you wanted to put a question to Wende and Matt.
Well, I'm glad you had clarity when you read the book, Suren. I came back a bit confused, to tell the truth, because there were dozens of writers. Everybody had their own point of view. Everybody said we needed peace. Everybody had different solutions, about what is to be done. So I'll talk more about that as we get into specific questions.
Okay. Well, fortunately, we have Wende and Matt here to help sort out our confusion to the extent that it exists, right? How do you respond to that, Wende, this observation from Yusuf, or perhaps my earlier observations?
Well, thank you, Suren, for your earlier observations. I share with you the idea that reading a reader is a snooze. And I'm also really excited, even though I worked for 4 years on this book, when I see the list of authors. I'm really proud of the list of authors. Yusuf, not everybody in the book is talking about peace. Cabral's piece on the message to the people in Portugal is written at a time when he's waging armed struggle. So the criteria for being in the book wasn't that peace was your thing. It was that you were thinking deeply about what violence was and how that was related to what we were struggling for and against. Does that make sense?
Not especially, because their title is Revolutionary Nonviolence. So I thought that was the thrust. And when you have people who actually had to resort to violence, and I'm not against either position, it's just that there are dozens of people with dozens of different responses to the question of violence or nonviolence. I also wanted to raise, the first thing that came to my mind was, when we talk about violence, are we talking about violence against people or other living beings? Or are we talking about violence against property? And I was thinking about the two lawyers, I think Colin,
Kaepernick?
Yes.
He's a football player.
Excuse me, who?
Colin Kaepernick?
No. The two lawyers who were arrested in New York City during the uprisings because they threw Molotov cocktails at police, Colin Ford Mattis and Uruj Rahman. Are you familiar with them? You should be.
I remember when it happened, yeah.
So
maybe Yusuf, to take your question a little further, both Matt and Wende have teased out for us the idea of structural violence, the violence of colonialism. Maybe we turn to Matt for a moment, and Matt, why don't you introduce to us the violence of colonialism and how that places particular demands on the decolonizing work and the tactical questions, the tools of violence and nonviolence that you refer to. Matt, are you there?
You're muted, Matt.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But the fact is, I think it's also useful to take a couple of steps back before we even get to that, or to the question, Yusuf, you posed about those lawyers. So first of all, let me say for myself, there's lots of different books and lots of different biographies of me. The titles that you said for me are a little shifted. I was elected some years after that bio was written, the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. So I don't just represent them at the UN, I represent them now pretty much everywhere. And I say that not just for a minor correction, but to say that really our goals, I think the goals of IPRA, but also Wendy's and my goal, was to have a volume that would be usable both for those in the gowns at the university and those in the town, those doing street action and work, organizing and activism, as well as those who are studying at the university and studying revolution wherever one does that. The second thing I want to say is that the title, which is not violence or nonviolence or decolonization, the title Insurrectionary Uprisings was a very specific one, and was also one that was not developed fundamentally post 2020. We came to that title beforehand, and suddenly the word insurrection became a thing in the United States on a different level and from a different perspective than we had been thinking about it. I'm not sure if one really calls January 6, 2021, or some of the other uprisings and rebellions post George Floyd of 2020, insurrections. But I think when we think about, when Wendy and I thought about insurrections and insurrectionary uprisings, we were thinking about terminology that specifically did not try to answer the question of violence versus nonviolence. And the versus part, I think, is the part that we're most contentious with. We have a history in the US, especially, more than anywhere else I've ever studied or traveled to, and I've traveled a lot. We have a history of loving to dichotomize things. It has to be someone versus someone, some tactic versus some tactic. And we get lost in the weeds and don't talk strategy and don't think strategically and certainly don't act strategically. So the tools that you're talking about and some of the tools we try to point to, intellectual tools for organizers in this book, are trying to get away from that false dichotomy. Now, one or two other things, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your last question, Suren, but I'll answer some of Yusuf's earlier questions. I don't think this book is trying to answer the question, what is to be done? It's not just that Lenin did a fine job for his time answering some of those questions. And it's not at all that we think that those questions, those fundamental what is to be done questions, aren't fundamentally still important. We believe that we need to continue to rigorously examine those questions with a fully historical materialist, a fully dialectical understanding of the world as it is today, not just as it was 100 years ago, not just as it was in 1848. And we believe that there are things that we have learned globally and in the international left about strategies and tactics, about the tactics of violence and nonviolence, about decolonization, and in talking about decolonization, about feminism, not just women, but feminism, and a deconstruction of not just capitalism, but heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and many other things that capitalism has certainly bolstered, but didn't always produce. So we look at a book that tries to raise the question of what is to be done, not answer it, in a refreshing way and in a way that draws from the past, but also looks at the present. So yes, we have Gandhi and Fanon in here, but we also have Gandhi's granddaughter, who's a South African militant who didn't choose strict nonviolence, but was a part of the ANC from its days underground. And we have Mireille Fanon Mendes Franz Fanon's daughter, who of course continues to be a deeply active human rights activist and liberation activist based in France. So we have current voices writing specifically for this volume to not have a singular answer, Yusuf, but to rather raise the question. And I guess I'll end with this point, which comes a little bit closer to answering Suren's question, but not quite. And I'll let the question linger and let Wendy have a go at it. I don't think there's a single thing in this book, not a single thing, that suggests that our concern is to protect property from violence. There is nothing in this book that suggests that violence against property is something of our concern. Yes, we are concerned that the sanctity of life is an issue. And that often when people talked about armed struggle, when people talked about a certain military approach towards revolutionary change, that while we do far from rule it out, we understand, as Amilcar Cabral of Africa, of the liberation movement of Guinea-Bissau said, we must be militants, not militarists. You know, it was the other part of that speech, tell no lies, claim no easy victories, that always gets the shine, that gets the quotations. But the very same speech, he says what I just said, distinguishing between militancy and militarists. We are anti-property, anti-capitalist militants. But we believe, as the Mozambicans, Graça Machel and others, learned after decades of struggle after they won independence that militarism itself is a problem unto itself. And so the question of the sanctity of life is a problem. Is it a problem in the traditional way that nonviolent activists, especially from the global north, have time and time using Gandhi and King almost as a mantra? No, that's not the way to look at it. It's why we say revolutionary nonviolence. But we certainly believe that the greatest violence of the world today is capital, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy based. And so a revolutionary violence, and maybe we could say revolutionary nonviolence, but maybe you should say revolutionary violence. All forms of revolutionary struggle, all tactical forms, are up for rigorous investigation today, because we believe that we need to develop. This book doesn't do it, but it hopefully raises a question of developing 21st century revolutionary praxis that understands all that we have to learn from the last 10, 20, 50 years of struggle.
I'm sorry that Matt, that I misconstrued your title. It is Insurrectionary Uprisings. Your subtitle, however, is A Reader in Revolutionary Nonviolence, which is where I got my revolutionary nonviolence quote from.
A reader in revolutionary
And
nonviolence and decolonization.
And decolonization.
And I'm going to let Wendy say a little more about why that "and" is not an add-on, but it's central.
The book contains edited pieces from Anibal Quijano and Maria Lugones talking about the intersubjective, first of all, exegeting white supremacy and colonial capitalism, and then talking about the intersubjective processes that we must enter to understand who we are. Outside of the crosshairs of colonialism and white supremacy and gender binary and all that other stuff. So I think that's a really important part of the book. The longer that we worked on it, putting this group of readers together, the more clear it was that that was critical to the argument.
Wendy, could you unpack some of those terms for us, please? For example, Matt suggests that this book is firmly within the tradition of historical materialism, and it's an application. And you also appeal to intersubjectivity, which is often not associated with historical materialism. And I found it very convincing as to how you put these concepts together, and also the point that Matt made about property and violence, particularly in your chapter, Tasting the Earth, in which you do show us how violence is intimately related to the creating of property itself. But can you tell us how we put together these ideas of intersubjectivity and historical materialism?
Well, so first, let me just say that although one of our comrades who's writing a review of the book is somewhat scathing about how we didn't include Lenin, I would like to say, yeah, we didn't include Lenin. The frame for this book is Audre Lorde, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And if we understand the way that the master's tools saturate down to the cells of our being, not just the social structure, but the cells of our being, our bodies, our spirits, we understand that we have to come to a new understanding of what it means to be human, right? What it means to be human in a world that is built on extreme violence, which we are all caught up in one way or another. And looking to understand how the categories that support and build that violence need to be gone, right? And what does it take to do that work?
Thanks, Wendy.
I don't want to give away the ending. People should read the book to find out how we win. No, that's a little bit of a joke, but there's a very poignant part that I think speaks in part to the question of violence and nonviolence in a late chapter written by Wendy, actually, because even though we're the co-editors, we each have some of our own writings in this book. And Wendy basically puts a challenge to white workers of the global north. And she said, this nonviolence thing is up to you. You know, this nonviolence thing is ultimately, and I'm paraphrasing, Wende, and you'll say it better than I ever will, but, and you said it amazingly in the writing of the book, but, you know, essentially, this whole nonviolence thing that y'all have been talking about and championing, especially white people, white men in the North, not that many other people haven't championed it, but the way global North scholars and some activists have regurgitated this ethic of nonviolence as a dogma, almost as a religion, not as a tactic. And I don't want to reduce it simply to tactics. We are, as Wende said, talking about ways to be human. And there is something about violence and nonviolence and militarism and a moving away from militarism. No true revolutionary is guided by ultimately anything other than love. We believe that both Gandhi and Che Guevara said that, and many others have said things like, close to that. So how do you operationalize that? How do you actualize that love of the people? But the idea that the real concern about nonviolence is what some of those white workers in the North, some of us, can do with it. It's not an interrogation, as is so often used, a baton to say, oh, people in struggle in the majority of the world, you people fighting against oppression, you people fighting for liberation in Asia, Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and in the internal colonies of the North, you people should really be less violent. No, that's not it at all. That's, in fact, the direct mistake of these dichotomized thoughts about nonviolence. If revolutionary nonviolence is to have any usefulness in the 21st century, it's going to be because massive numbers of white workers and their allies will refuse to continue to use the tool of violence for oppressive purposes, for imperialism. And if there's not a revolutionary change of mind where people put their those people put their guns down, then we're in for a very, very violent time indeed. And the violence will not be a simple one of good guys versus bad guys. It's going to be very, very complicated and very tragic in some ways.
Can I just, Suren, can I just add, maybe Yusuf, this is part of what you were getting at earlier. The question of violence or nonviolence is pretty moot, right? We live in an incredibly violent world. We are the product of incredible violence. And in that piece, I was trying to point out that white people, many white people, even working class white people, live at the expense of our dead Black and Indigenous bodies, for example. And so the question of violence and nonviolence needs to be turned around a little bit, because we're already embedded in deeply violent structures.
Yusuf, did you want to follow up, or should I go ahead?
It occurred to me when I was thinking through this that at least in the Black community, since the 60s and the 70s, there hasn't really been a call for any kind of violence, primarily out of a practical concern that COINTELPRO locked up any of the revolutionaries who did call for violence. And so that tactic had just faded out because people didn't want to go to jail, people didn't want to be killed. I don't know if you concur with that or
I concur with that.
Well, I think that's a simplification, but it's a correct one. I mean, Yusuf, I think you know, and others may know, you know, in addition to and alongside of the international work I do with IPRA and other groups, you know, bringing together peace and justice scholars with activists and organizers all around the world, the main US work I do is with a relatively new coalition called Spirit of Mandela Coalition, which put on an international tribunal last October 2021, and is led by people like, not just people like, but led by Sekou Odinga, Jalil Muntaqim, Jihad Abdul Hamid, Taqi Kione Siddiqui, and others. But these are former prisoners who served decades, close to 50 years in Jalil's case, as political prisoners from the Black Panther and the Black Liberation Army. So that's clear. I think, Yusuf, what you said is crystal clear, but I think it is part of this moment, this uniquely 21st century moment now, which is in fact up for grabs and confusing, because some will say and look at the Panthers. There's a cottage industry of books and events that are looking at the Panthers in a way that's rah, 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 but doesn't really get past Huey and Bobby and Oakland. It doesn't look at any of the complexities, or very few. There are some books. You talk about the Brecht Forum, and our dear brother Sam Anderson and Herb Boyd have written some of the books that have been better than that, but so much. And now people like Sekou and Dhoruba bin Wahad are writing other things that interrogate things more complexly, the Black Panther Party Reconsidered. But so many books are written that don't even get past Jump Street, and that look at the Panthers and look at Weather Underground and look at other formations that went to armed struggle in ways that are caricatures at best. And then on the other hand, I've already spoken about the caricatures of Gandhi and nonviolence. So to me, that's not about violence and nonviolence. It's about a truly 21st century revolutionary look at the world today versus reform. Because, violence and nonviolence can be used. It's not just nonviolence that can be used for reformist purposes. We can look narrow-mindedly or short-term. And again, we know that every revolution ever in the history of the world has been built upon the building blocks of many, many reforms. So it's not to speak against reforms per se, but to limit oneself only in a box that doesn't really look towards the larger picture, towards more radical solutions to the problems of the day, can rely on either any tactic. And so I think it's not just to say that there hasn't been a great call to arms. It's also not just to say that because there's not an armed struggle within the US, that the US left is nonviolent. The US left is non-anything. I mean, the US left is almost non-existent in my view. And the international left, I think we have a lot to learn from the global South. And so when we look at some scholars like Lugonis and Kionis and some of the other scholars, I mean, Wende mentions Audre Lorde. I think there are some profound thinkers, but was Lorde a great Marxist? Well, no. Does it matter? Absolutely not. Do we need to look at Marx? Of course. But to me, there are so many people who are in the global South today, both theoretically and practically, looking at some of the issues that the US left is just beginning to interrogate, that we have a lot of catching up to do here. And this book, though not geared only to the US, begins to try to do that,
Matt
In
and
your
Wende.
framework,
Go ahead, Yusuf.
is there space for intentional communities, communes, or is that something that you consider a waste of time?
I can answer that, Matt, if you want. I mean, no, I don't consider intentional communities a waste of time. And before I answer any further, I just want to call everybody's attention to the fact that we have begun to fall into the abyss of climate catastrophe, that fascism is breathing down our neck, and we are in the middle of a pandemic. We aren't even in the middle of it, but we're in a pandemic that we do not know when it will end. And so it is not the 60s or the 70s. It is a very, very critical time on our planet. And we can get it together as best we can, or we can't. And if we don't, then humanity is at stake. And so I want to quote Berta Casares in this book, who talks about the highest calling is to give your life for humanity, for the rivers and the trees and the people. So if intentional communities help do that, if communes help do that, then I have no other position than to say that that makes sense to me.
Wendy, thank you for rooting us in the moment, which is epochal in nature, that decisions we make today determine whether there's a future, really. And so, and invoking the memory of Berta Cáceres to do that, I think, is most appropriate. I'm wondering if actually, let me pause for a moment and tell everyone who's joined us that we're going to open this up for broader questions from everyone who's listening at around 2 p.m. But to get back to the moment of Berta Cáceres, the problem of climate change, and the nature of this particular book, Matt did a good job of resituating the conversation from my introduction. In my introduction, I called attention to the uprising of 2020. And of course, this book was in the making for a much longer period. And two things have happened. Not only did we have the uprising of 2020, but we also have the so-called insurrection of 2021. So there are words that unfortunately will be used to interpret your book in fairly narrow ways. The book, however, begins, in a corner of West Asia, in Palestine, with the introduction by your by the preface from your friend from American Friends Service Committee. And it is profoundly global in nature. You've just alluded to comrades from Peru and Argentina. Could you sketch for us the scale, like how it is you chose to include particular geographical areas and experiences as they relate to the current moment, the challenges you've just spoken to, Wendy?
Yeah, the book took us about 4 years. And it was a lot of reading and editing and trying to figure out what would go where. I think we made a decision early on that we weren't going to replicate a book that has all the usual people nattering on about nonviolence, and that we needed to look deeper and figure out how what people were saying was related to nonviolence. So Fannie Lou Hamer is in the book, talking about her experience being arrested, and talking about the kind of violence that she survived because she insisted on the right to vote. So I think we thought about whose voices need to be heard, who is not often considered. So Fannie Lou Hamer is in there, and Leslie Feinberg is in there talking about transliberation, and Berta Cáceres is in there, for example. And I think all of those things point to, well, I mean, one of the things they point to is that we're tired of listening to European white men dictate what revolution is all about. And I don't care if you're Lenin or whoever, right? There are many other voices, right? And for me, what it means to try to figure out a world where we can all be human is to honor my African and indigenous ancestors and to listen to the voices of the past, right? The Sankofa moment is that we cannot go forward unless we can remember the past, unless we can remember our way out of this global white supremacist, cis hetero patriarchal capitalism. And so partly that influenced us a lot in terms of who we picked, who should go in the book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, did you want to add to that?
Well, it's a couple of pieces. I mean, it's everything Wendy said, and maybe a little bit more. But the fact is, we come upon an era where, in some ways, it feels like, Yusuf, your question of grassroots collectives is as prescient as ever. We're not against the idea of some centralized organizing, cadre and otherwise, but the idea of decentralized, community-based collectives seems not only possible, but essential. And in some ways, maybe a missing piece of some of the organizing that was done 50, 60, 70 years ago, that the so-called affinity group or the local collective or the cooperative takes on a greater meaning and importance now as we look towards building effective radical alternative spaces in the belly of the beast and on the periphery of the big forces upon us. So yes, I think those things are not just to be considered, but to be supported and emphasized and built up. It's not to say that coordination isn't important, and we have no further to look than South Africa, Suren, and your home town, where we see we only got to a point where we could look at a dismantling of political apartheid, and no one is under any illusion that economic apartheid was ever dismantled in any major way, nor I think should we suggest that the dismantling of political apartheid was nothing, was no big deal. It was. But it was built not only because of major international forces of negotiation as well as sanctions and boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, to use a current term, focusing on Palestine, of course, and the need to liberate Palestine. But it was also built by these massive numbers of literally thousands upon thousands of grassroots, community-based efforts to make apartheid ungovernable in the era of the United Democratic Movement, in the era of the movement, the mass democratic movement, and building up from the grassroots to the top. So it's not one or the other. Again, like violence and nonviolence, I don't want to counterpose decentralized or centralized organizing. We need a bit of both. But it is to say, Yusuf, that you're right on target. And maybe that gets me to Suren, your question. I believe that we looked at this. I mean, 4, 5, 6 years ago, we began looking about what this thing, revolutionary nonviolence, what those two concepts, the concept of revolution, which is not often thought of from terms of violence and nonviolence, or from nonviolence, and the terms of a revolutionary nonviolence. That became less and less the further we got in, when it was clear that decolonization was as, if not more, central to our thinking, and it's why the book title didn't have, except in the subtitle, nonviolence in it. But it began to become clear, I think, that there are so many places where there's been more revolutionary struggle, more real-world, cutting-edge, frontline struggle that we can learn from, than is often understood in the global North. So, I mean, a little example, just a tiny one. The Puerto Rican struggle, which has this nexus point between the global North and South, the last major colony of the leading empire in the world, US's final, ultimate direct colony, has understood more about this dialectic between violence and nonviolence than I think many struggles. So when you look at someone like Oscar Lopez Rivera, the former political prisoner, in prison for being a leader of the FALN, the Armed Forces of National Liberation, now coming out and saying that love force, again, like Che and like Gandhi, is really needs to be entangled. He doesn't specify that love force means strict nonviolence or a commitment to armed struggle. It's an understanding that decolonization has to be more than any one thing. It has to be multi-tactical, has to be multi-ideological. But for example, it was not hard to find, though it's never been published before, some letters of the Puerto Rican patriot Lolita Lebron. Now, Lolita has reams of extraordinary writing, and obviously the testimony of the act that she did, one of the first leading women revolutionaries of Latin America to lead an armed group as they went into Congress in the 1950s and shot the place up a bit. But we chose to take a piece of hers from when Lolita Lebron was in prison, and she was writing to the Catholic worker pacifist icon Dorothy Day, because that juxtaposition, that understanding that we don't say we're only going to talk to people who agree with us in every way, that idea of a conversation across ideological, tactical, and even strategic grounds is the type of conversation that we have to have more of today, that we have to focus on today. And it's a decolonizing conversation. It's a movement building conversation. And yes, it builds up largely from the ground up, but it has other manifestations as well.
one other direction in which one could take when the question that Yusuf put to you that comes out of the book is the place of Cooperation Jackson in developing strategy, especially when we think about the diverse practices that they're involved with. I'm wondering, Wendy, if you wanted to say a little bit about People's Strike and about Cooperation Jackson, and how we get to answer the kinds of questions that Matt has raised. That, you know, we're in the global north here, and we're quite removed from the revolutionary practices of the global south, and yet we have this experience of People's Strike and of Cooperation Jackson. How does that help us?
Well, Cooperation Jackson is an example of an organization that never stops trying, right? I mean, and I think that's part of what we need to remember. Somebody the other day quoted this to me. They said, we fail, but we survive. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Not that Cooperation Jackson is failing, but you know, Kali and Saki and the other people in Cooperation Jackson have no intention of giving up, right? And they believe that they believe in a solidarity economy, and that cooperative places point the way forward, right? Kali was the convener of People's Strike, which happened during April of 2020 when the pandemic was brand new, calling together people to think about what it would take to make a general strike, to have a general strike in the US, as with the understanding that that was a critical tactic for toppling capitalism, which is something we all care a lot about. People's Strike is going through some revisions and you know, trying to figure itself out in the current climate. But I think that's an example of an effort, right? And one of the things I've learned being in People's Strike is that you constantly have to assess where you're going in order to keep moving, right? You can't just do things and do things. So it's not just, you know, keep trying. It's keep trying and assess, and figure out how to move forward. Yeah.
It's the essence. It's the essence of study and struggle, and study again and struggle again. It's the essence of putting to practice those words, that adage, and the fact that Kali, Acuna, and Saki, and so many others less well known, the idea that Cooperation Jackson and the idea that People's Strike continue to do that. And we see that in the work, but we also see that in the writing and in the intellectual production that comes out of that small collective. You know, what one is working to plug this book today, but it's hard not to mention that Daraja Press's wonderful support of Wendy and me in this book parallels PM Press's work of another book that my name gets on. Kali and I have a co-edited work, Jackson Rising Redo, coming out any moment now that looks more at that specific example. But the fact is, Cooperation Jackson may be a leading, perhaps the leading one within the US empire, but there are many, many others all around the world. And I think that's the point. The other thing to say about Kali and People's Strike is that there's an international tradition that's also focused on in this book that I think is worth noting, and that is eco-socialism. And the idea of eco-socialism, especially eco-socialism as practiced and defined by the Venezuelan movement, especially Afro-Venezuelans and the Trueque work that was put forward in Venezuela at a global gathering that Kali and I were both in attendance of, along with many, many others, called the First Eco-Socialist International. That's another strand. We talked about feminism. We talked about different decolonization thinkers. And I think the eco-socialist strand is another vital one that Cooperation Jackson and People's Strike in some ways champion within the US, but has a global piece to it that's worth noting.
The idea of the mass strike, and this is responding to people's strike in some ways, at least from Rosa Luxemburg's perspective, wasn't literally the idea of withdrawing our labor, although it's part of it, but the idea that we can, through the concept of a mass strike, understand the boundaries of the working class itself. It's a myth of a mass strike, a myth in a positive way. And that helps us think about who our allies are, and it's firmly rooted, of course, in class. I have a question to Yusuf now, going to his entry point of the cooperative institutions and relating it to the mass strike to a certain extent. Yusuf, I know that you're doing a lot of work about Afrocentrism and Afrocentric thinking and cooperative institutions as well. Did you want to say something about that and how it relates to the idea of the mass strike, which is different from the cooperative and cooperative movements?
I don't know if I can relate what I'm doing to a concept of a mass strike. I know that, and I don't know if people understand this as being escapist or being non-confrontational, but a lot of groups in the African American community that consider themselves radical or revolutionary had just simply pulled out of the system and created communities of their own, in which they practice many of the tenets that Wende talked about in her article about the Hawaiian group. So they're getting closer to the earth, they're vegetarian, et cetera, et cetera. And in this sense, some people might consider them not contributing to a revolutionary confrontation, but from their perspective, and from my perspective also, they've pulled out of the system. They no longer participate in the system as it is.
Can I say something just about cooperatives and mass strike? There is no possibility for a mass strike to be successful without massive mutual aid and solidarity economy work. Somebody has to feed the babies, right, and change their diapers. Somebody has to make sure everybody on the picket lines are fed. And so, the male, masculinist conception is, workers on the picket line, but there's a whole lot of stuff behind that means that mass strike will be successful. And I think that's really important to say. And then, Yusuf, I completely agree with you. All those people who are doing urban gardening, who are reaching back to ancestral wisdom to understand how to make a healthy tomato, we need those people, because those are going to be the people who know how to make the food that we don't have access to as we slip farther into this abyss.
Thanks, Wende. I'd like to turn to people who've been listening to this conversation so far. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll engage with Wende and Matt on those questions. While we're waiting for some questions, I will turn to your inclusion of Colin Kaepernick into this collection. Colin Kaepernick talks about anti-Blackness, and I'd like you all to explain how it's so centrally tied up as a concept into the work that we have to do. What does it name? What does anti-Blackness name? And what is the work that we have to do once we recognize the underlying phenomena that create anti-Blackness?
Are you asking me, Suren?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So I was really, I was the advocate for Colin Kaepernick's work. I was struck by his speech at the Amnesty International gathering. And I think it's important to notice when somebody is brilliant, even if they're an NFL football player. I also think that a lot of young people, like Colin Kirkpatrick, has had this huge impact on young people, and in ways that I don't even begin to understand. But certainly that voice needs to be included, you know, in a discussion of this. I think that it's very hard here in the United States for people to take in the magnitude of anti-Blackness, of anti-Indigenousness, right? Of this white supremacist, Eurocentric understanding of the world, which means that the rest of us are considered less. Well, you know, really, it's about some tremendous white mediocrity that has been, you know, duped into believing that it's the smartest and the best and the most beautiful. So on a very, very basic level, it's about reclaiming ourselves and understanding our own beauty and our own brilliance, which far exceeds the mediocrity of white supremacy. And what that has to do with where we need to go to practice humanity in a better sense. I think that is fundamental. That gets, you know, Colin Kaepernick said it, and also, you know, Lugones and Quijano in the section on resisting empire talk about that. So that's critical. And, you know, that's something that kind of gets swept under the rug, right? And that people aren't constantly dealing with, but it's critical to going forward. And it's critical for all of us, right? Because a lot of, you know, I think if you grow up in this world, you are not going to be able, without a lot of support, to recognize the hypocrisy of white supremacy, right? You are not going to easily be able to recognize how saturated we are with white mediocrity everywhere we turn. So that is clearly part of what needs to happen.
I also think it's complicated internationally. You know, I think the root of what, Wendy, you're talking about in terms of that hypocrisy and that in some ways misunderstanding or inability to confront, to realize, to soak in, to fully feel intellectually and personally, interpersonally, that beauty on the one hand and mediocrity on the other is part of what makes good radicals, good, thoughtful, otherwise brilliant radicals misunderstand the US. How can you elect? I mean, it's not just about neoliberalism or about understanding the machinations of capital. How can you elect a Barack Obama and then elect a Donald Trump? How can you have a mass uprising in 2020 post George Floyd and then not have a movement? And I think those questions begin to be answered by what Wendy just said. They begin to be answered by an understanding of what Blackness and anti-Blackness means as a force within the empire and within the centers of empire that we have not interrogated as fully. Now, it may be that we threw in more inspiring comments like Colin Kaepernick's than similarly inspiring comments from, you know, 1911 or 1960, because, you know, that's today and right now and exciting. But it does seem to me that Kaepernick and others, though they may not have some of the profundities or complexities of other pieces in this book, do point to a certain hopeful possibility, a certain opening. And, you know, in addition to editors and writers and thinkers, Wendy and I are both organizers, and one has to grasp onto any little hopeful thing that one might find in these times and say, maybe there will be a way to make the message a little bit more mass and a little bit more clear. And so Kaepernick is in there, and this analysis is in there for all of those reasons.
Thanks, Matt. I noticed that we have a question from Beverly. Beverly, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? Oops, can one of the co-hosts unmute Beverly?
Okay, thank you. I was just really curious about, I wasn't able to be here for the whole talk, but I'm curious whether social ecology is something that you look to in writing the book? I'm a former faculty member from ISE and am very aware that the social ecology faculty and students were part of many progressive movements and catalyzed many local grassroots things that continue today. And many of us are, I identify as BIPOC, and many of us have been very influenced by Afro and Indigenous futurisms and queer futurisms to develop this work. I'm inspired by the fact that your book is seeing as its core, one of its core influences is Audre Lorde. And I think I'm just curious whether social ecology is part of the spectrum of what you looked at.
Wendy and Matt?
Beverly.
Let me quickly this time, if I can, I'll be very quick, and then Wendy, you can finish it up. I mean, I think we don't use the term so much. In that sense, we could say we didn't give it the kind of maybe the kind of focus we should. At the other hand, it's noteworthy that one of our partners in this, and someone who certainly not only helped us in early conceptualization, but also wrote an original piece for this book that's coming out in this book only, is Nestor King, who's done a lot of work with that organization and in those circles, and in developing ecofeminism and that piece of the social ecology movement. So I think yes, but more is necessary.
Wendy?
I think Victor might have his hand up. I don't know.
Okay, yep. Victor
And I
does.
will note that Beverly in the chat, for those who are not seeing the chat, wrote, yes, Nestor. So, okay, right on.
So, Victor, you're muted. I'm going to unmute you. Should introduce Victor Wallace really quickly. Victor's the editor at large of the journal Socialism and Democracy, which I'm also connected with. And Victor has written probably as expansively as anyone I know about virtually all the issues that we've been discussing right now. So Victor, I'm really curious to hear your comment or question.
Thank you, Suren, for that generous introduction. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, which I haven't seen yet. But I think that the ideas that you've expressed constitute a kind of basis for overcoming all the false dichotomies, sources of unnecessary division and conflict. And I guess still what I come back to, I guess, is the perception. Movement is so fragmented now. And I think your analysis provides, let's say, an underlying basis for overcoming that. But I guess I wonder, and maybe there's something on it in your book, whether there's some kind of, whether you see some kind of organizational expression, organizational steps that could be taken to bring together these different constituencies of oppression to constitute a unified movement that could be an effective political force. Thank you.
Wow. So let me just say also, Victor, to have you talk about the book, possibly having some of the seeds or basis for thinking about such an expression, and having you note that is itself one of the best compliments that I can. If we did a little of that, in this talk today, then I feel proud and pleased, because as Suren said, I don't think he was particularly generous. I think he was being accurate to the body of work that you've given us. Victor, I don't think in the U.S. there's an organizational expression, quite frankly, and I don't think internationally there's one. So much so, I think the first Eco-Socialist International was and is an attempt, one of many that's emerging. Suren talked about this work that he and I have done in the movements of movement circles. I think we're in this time period that is for reasons we can understand in terms of the global political economy, in terms of the role of the military and military might, and the way the U.S. empire in its vicious but steady decline is now looking at new imperialism. So we have Russia, China, the U.S. and the BRICS at least. vying for regional superpower status or regional sub-superpower status. We have the pandemic. Also, of course, the rise of fascism everywhere, not just the US. I think all of those speak to an interrogation that's going on in many parts of the left that is looking for a form, looking for new forms, organizational, coalition, or united front based and otherwise. And again, this book begins to not answer, but ask some of the questions that we think need to be looked at when developing such a form. Look, people strike when the pandemic hit and Cooperation Jackson raised it, seemed to both Wende and myself independently as one potential formation to put some time and energy into. The fact that we gave a solid year or 18 months or 2 years of our lives to a formation that's now undergoing its own internal reflection doesn't say anything about those 2 years or about that formation. We may not have the answer to Victor's key and poignant question, but I think we are in process within the US and internationally, both intellectually and as organizers, to help figure out how to put the building blocks together to create that new 21st century model of a revolutionary united front and organization. I don't think we're there yet in quite direct and honest answer to Victor's question. No, I don't think we have that yet. But I think we have the seeds, Eco-Socialists First, Eco-Socialists International, People Strike, and others. Wende, I hope, will give us more of those seeds. She put her hand up, and that makes me excited. Go ahead, Wende.
I don't know, but Suren, did you want to say something? I wanted to respond to Victor, but
No, I was hoping precisely that you'd address this question of agency and go ahead.
so I think it's an interesting question, but I think we should learn not to expect some kind of unified, centralized struggle group. Certainly not one with leadership that looks like leadership currently looks. So there are a lot of struggling communities around the world and in this place, in this belly of the beast. And in order for there to be a viable struggle, people in those marginalized, abandoned places have to find their voice. It will not do for, I mean, one of the problems I have with the US left is the predominance of the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that, college educated, status seeking young people of color are becoming, management in those organizations. And in the process, they no longer represent the aspirations of the people they claim to represent. They toe the line to the IRS. So what I would hope is that there is a plethora or a broad and deep rising of people who recognize their own power, see their own beauty, and know how to call into account elected officials, nonprofit organization officials, labor union officials, and all the people who claim to be representing us on some kind of revolutionary road.
Thank you, Wende. Yusuf, did you want to address this question too? If not, we have another question.
I was wondering, because I don't know that much about the movement of movements, and I'm wondering, where does this coalition of people from different movements take place? Does it take place on the ground at a grassroots level? Or should it take place at a managerial level? And if it takes place at a managerial level, then there's the problems that, of course, that Wende just addressed. But it seems to me that some communities are so afraid to enter coalitions with people whom they think have not learned the lessons of anti-Black racism, in my community anyway, so that they're isolated. They do have to become involved in some overall struggle, but where do we do this? Do we do this at some hierarchical level where we bring leaders of organizations together? Or do we just try to hope that people, meet on the street and in street demonstrations and become friends. Now, I know that that largely takes place between people who are in college. It doesn't take place primarily with people who are, for example, in communities who have not gone into some kind of space where there's interracial interaction.
So I think that's a profound and important question, a vital follow-up question to Victor's. And Yusuf, obviously your points are so key and so fundamental. I think both for the Black Liberation Movement and your allies here in the empire, but also internationally. So I'll say this. I do feel like, and again, I fight against a sense of real dread and doom about fascism in the US and about the next year being very bleak. But to me, part of what was so exciting about the Spirit of Mandela Coalition and what continues to be, part of what was so exciting about the October 2021 tribunal, which not only said we still charge genocide, as Robeson and Du Bois and William Patterson did 70 years ago, as Malcolm X and others did in their time with the Organization of Afro-American Unity. But today, 21st century, genocide and human rights abuses, US human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are an ongoing thing, and an international tribunal of distinguished human rights scholars and global activists affirm that the US is guilty of genocide. That framework, both intellectually and operationally, did and does begin to have a coalition of groups beyond just the Elder Panthers, beyond just some of their young adherents, beyond just even the Black Liberation Movement and folks from the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and many, many different grassroots groups that participated in that structure. Puerto Rican, Mexican, Chicano, and white groups continue to be part of that ongoing coalition work, which is building towards a People's Senate in the coming year or two or three, looking towards really the building blocks of new movements and new coalitions with a Black liberation understanding, a Black radical tradition at the center of it, but building out more broadly. I also think that internationally, in addition to some of the ones that we've named, we do have, yes, again, what Yusuf said was so profound. We do have in some ways a bottom-up series of initiatives. And I'll just say the one I think that's the most exciting to me, and there are many, I'm excited by more than one, but there has been, not just on the street, because now the street in part is represented by Zoom and other formations. We meet a little bit here, not through social media, but in forms of international communication that don't just involve in-person gatherings, although obviously we know that these virtual gatherings are limited. But there's been, for example, through a stream that Resistance Studies and other peoples have mentioned, a gathering of still occupied, still colonized people, occupied peoples forum, if you will. Right now, we have peoples from Puerto Rico and Palestine, from West Papua and Western Sahara, from Kashmir and Rojava Kurdistan, from Ambazonia and from Tibet, that have been cooperating over the last 2 years at thinking about how these struggles of still colonized, still occupied people can learn from one another, can build South-South cross-border solidarity, and can build alliances from without. So to me, some of those questions are being answered tentatively and in early forms in some of these structures, not top down, but with some real potential on national, federal, international, and cross-border levels.
No, it seems to me that there are also a number of gatherings coming up, NATO in Spain soon, and the inter-American gathering that Biden's convening in Los Angeles in, is it later this month or early May? Sorry, in June. And so it looks like there will be parallel gatherings of social movements there, but it still leaves the questions that we've all been raising so far unanswered. One of the earlier answers that Matt alluded to, actually spoke in some detail about, was the 1980s experience in South Africa, the emergence of a movement from two directions, from the grassroots, hundreds and hundreds of organizations representing actual communities, networking with each other, building the horizontal connections, but also at the same time, a kind of vertical coordination point in the form of the National Liberation Movement. So it seems like we're never going to be answering these questions with the two-letter coordinating conjunction or, right? It's always going to be and. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if by turning to the regular host for this program, Joe Ramsey, we could explore the question of organization a bit more, the question of transformation a bit more, because I know Joe has a question. Joe?
Okay. Thank you, Suren. Thank you, Wendy and Matt, for your work. I have not had a chance to read the book, but I'm definitely enticed to read it. I mean, I think these are absolutely crucial questions. I really like the title. And I like this effort to problematize that kind of false binary or facile binary, right? What does it mean to talk about nonviolence versus violence in a society that is inherently and deeply and historically founded on violence, right? Very important. I wanted to draw out something, not knowing the contents of the book yet. I was struck during the conversation. You reminded me of some things I've read and watched and heard from Grace Lee Boggs. I don't know if she made it into your collection or not, but I really recommend the recent film American Revolutionary to people. And one quote that I think makes it into that film, and I just tracked it down online, she has, and of course, many worthy, pithy quotes, but this is one of them with some ellipses in it. So bear with me if it's not precise, but why is nonviolence such an important philosophy? She asks, because it respects the capacity of human beings to grow, and we owe that to each other, which to me sounds really powerful. And I don't mean to invoke that in a polemical against violence way, but I guess the question I have there is, in its core to the Boggs's work, right, was this kind of belief in the potential of human transformation. And I think particularly in a society such as the United States, which is so undoubtedly founded on multiple and interlocking oppressions and inequities and media distortions, pardon the background, and segregation that makes it hard to know people outside of one's own, bubble sometimes. What do you see as the kind of basis for human transformation being possible, particularly regarding people who have come out of historically oppressor communities? What are I'm kind of curious here, and I welcome an answer that's philosophical or that draws on the reader or on history. Like I just taught an anti-war course on war and empire, and I'm thinking about the GI anti-war resistance movement, right, during Vietnam, and the inspiration and how much that shocked students to realize that there were people who did that. And of course, that movement was very much influenced by Black revolutionary currents at the time. I'm just kind of curious if you could say more, whether it's drawing from the reader or just your own thoughts on the kind of tail end of this project about the possibility for human transformation and also maybe the necessity of it. Because it seems to me, at least maybe I'm thinking two nation state terms, but unless we crack that nut, in some meaningful way, revolution in the United States is a bloodbath. Right. I mean, and in a nuclear armed war worlds, I mean, maybe that's true anywhere. So I'd love just to hear, I'm going to read the book and maybe we can correspond more in depth in that context, but I'd love to hear you, either of you or from the reader, some more on this kind of question of either historical precedents, theoretical possibilities, or really kind of the necessity of kind of drawing out this human transformation way in a way that's not, I guess, I'll just say one other thing, not just moralistic, like against the violence, people like, hey, keep hope alive kind of stuff, don't get too militant, but that's strategic in nature, because it does seem to me important. And I think Grace Lee Boggs is at least one figure in that, which, is important to me. So thank you your responses, and pardon me if I was a little long-winded.
Thanks, Joe. Wendy or Matt, how would you like to address the question? Wendy, you're muted.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Grace Boggs is in the book. And I guess it reminds me of the piece I wrote, which is called "To Be Black and Simply Live" in the last section, which is basically a letter to the white working class. It says that nonviolence is entirely up to you, that if you can't transform, if you can't see your way to becoming human, then yeah, Joe, it'll be a bloodbath. And so I think that is one of the interesting things about nonviolence. I also think you have to say that humans have the potential to transform, but we don't really have all that much evidence in the United States that transformation is all that possible. This is, I think Matt is a lot more positive and optimistic than I am. So, I would also say that, in that piece, I cite George Jackson, who writes a lot about revolutionary sacrifice, because in lieu of that transformation of the white working class, in lieu of that transformation of whiteness, that's probably what we got.
Yeah, I'm sorry to report that I'm not sure whether my my occasionally optimism is based on anything empirical. It may simply be characterological, that I was born and raised a white kid from Brooklyn with a glasses half full perspective, as my main way of getting from one day to the next. That said, let me see if I can say a couple of positive things. There's nothing better than when someone like Joe, who hosts this, says, I don't know about this, but Grace Lee Boggs is great. And yeah, Grace Lee Boggs is right with us here on page 76. So yeah, we're with you right there, 100%. But I want to say something about South Africa, something about 2022, and then end with a little quote from Grace, if I can, to wrap up some things that Suren said right before Joe. Another piece of the South Africa in the 80s that's important, and again, South Africa did not have a full and complete revolution. No observer of that, no one who was part of that from the international side or domestic will say, victory to the people, we won everything we wanted. But the victory against political apartheid, I think, does count as something, looking towards how movements that are not quite revolution and not quite reform, but have a 21st century, late 20th century character to them. Not exactly national liberation, but not exactly nothing either. There's something there. I think one feature of it is that because of massive organizing, because of some of these structures that Suren and I both spoke about, because of massive international solidarity, because of multi-pronged approach, not or, but and, because of that, what everyone who grew up in the late 70s and 80s, the greatest intellectuals, the best activists, the most revolutionary, prescient, and profound among us, what all of us expected didn't take place. We almost all of us said, apartheid as a political structure would not end in our lifetime. And when it ended, it would end in a bloodbath. Neither of those things were true. And as Grace Paley, said, there are and will be enormous changes at the last minute. And as Dennis Brutus said, although he's paraphrased 1,000 different ways, and often this is attributed to Nelson Mandela, in revolutionary situations and times, one often thinks that something is impossible until it happens. And then it seems like it was inevitable. So if I hold on to any little bits of theoretical, not empirical hope, it's based on some of those examples. And I guess before quoting Grace Lee Boggs from the book, I want to also say that one of the profound influences, I think, of us and of this book, and I think of this moment, of this not or but and, is the Zapatista movement in Mexico and beyond, who talk about a world where many worlds fit. a world where many worlds fit. And I think that speaks to, from a theoretical basis, but also practically in the way they build, the idea that we're not talking about ors, we're talking about ands. So now let me read a little bit from Grace Lee Boggs. Let her have the final word to this section of Q&A. Grace was really talking in this particular section about the beloved community, about King's, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's agency as an organizer. She points out, he was only an organizer for 13 years, which is a relatively short time. Many of us in this call have been organizing longer than that, perhaps without quite the same impact. But she talks about what that meant and what that means for today. And she wrote that. In talking about some of the fundamental issues in the freedom movement, he not only empowered those on the front lines, but in the process developed a strategy for transforming a struggle for rights into a struggle that advances the humanity of everyone in the society, and thereby brings the beloved community closer to realization. This, Grace writes, is what true revolutions are about. They are about redefining our relationships with one another, to the earth and to the world, about creating a new society in the places and spaces left vacant by the disintegration of the old, about hope, not despair, about saying yes to life and no to war, about finding the courage to love and care for the peoples of the world as we love and care for our own families. And that's Grace Lee Boggs.
Thank you, Matt. I'd like to see if there are any other questions or comments. Or Yusuf, did you want to respond to what you've heard? You'll have to unmute, Yusuf.
I don't have a response right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Matt, too, for reading that piece from Grace Lee Boggs. I think when I think about the entire book, and to end with Grace Lee Boggs opining on the beloved community, I think is a really fitting place to sort of pause our conversation. I imagine that we will be continuing to have this conversation. I also know that if our earlier discussion of the book focused to a great extent on the question of organization and lamenting the lack of organization, while also bearing in mind Matt's final observation from Dennis Brutus that everything appears impossible until it happens. I think that we're all in an interesting place right now. We're also at an interesting space in this sort of global political moment where the violence that we see around the world has become concentrated and focused in the ruling class mind on one specific part of Eastern Europe, Western Asia. And yet we are here to remind people that yes, indeed, that is a situation that deserves our attention, but so too are all these other conflict zones, these other spaces, and the conflict zone is not a particular geographic location, but a social structure that affects us all, no matter where we live. From Wende and from Matt, I'm great. We have received a book that helps us engage with these struggles. I think there will be future conversations, perhaps one that extends to East Asia, Central Asia, parts of the world that have not yet been engaged by this, by the work of Matt and Wende, at least in this particular volume. And so there are other struggles for us to engage with. On that note, then, I'd like to, sorry, Yusuf, go ahead.
I do have a comment or a question. Yes. And that is,
okay.
I'm trying to figure out how global this phenomena is that we see in communities of color in the United States, from Black communities in New York, for example, where there is violence unorganized violence, or perhaps organized, but by the underclass, or by the lumpen, or by the people who are the least, those who are the most affected by oppression. And it's being launched at innocent bystanders. It's the whole issue of the lumpen proletariat, as Marx quoted it, those who are feeding on the proletariat, on the working class. I mean, it's classical, but it's also being manifested right now to a large degree. And I'm wondering if that's something that's occurring internationally, if you noticed that in other places where there's this intense poverty. And well, of course, in Mexico and in Central America, I realize that there are these gangs that are predator gangs, and that's causing a lot of people to try to emigrate to the United States. But I'm wondering if this is a more global phenomenon.
And I think this is how our conversation will continue to proceed in fits and starts. It'll never quite conclude, but I think Yusuf has reopened our conversation to a certain extent. And so what about this question of lumpens, people who are directly impacted by the worst effects of our system, and who may not be responding, who are not responding in the ways that we'd want them to respond? Can we start with Matt and give Wende the final word?
Geez, I hate to start on such a potentially negative note, though I think, again, Yusuf's question is profound and correct. So we'll just have to say that this is the beginning of the next conversation we'll have, rather than the start of this one. Look, I think the developing of right-wing populist and fascist movements everywhere, that other way in which the word insurrection is being used these days, I don't want them to take over that word just yet. I think it's a product of that which Yusuf, you asked. So I think it is a global phenomenon. We certainly see it, as you noted, in Latin America. We see it in parts of Africa and Asia as well. It takes slightly different characters in different places, who you call the proletariat versus, agricultural. But I think the idea that we have spaces for tremendous disorganization and counter-revolution and right-wing movement, including fascist and neo-fascist, is a product of that. It does not mean that we give up. Obviously, what it means is we dig in, we dig deep, and it means that we have to become better at organizing. We have to become better at understanding how to organize on those levels and in those spaces. And I'll just end it here. I'll end it here in part because, in addition to being a profound thinker and a fantastic co-editor, Wende's got to be one of the best organizers I've ever worked with. So have some profound closing thoughts for us, will you, my dear sister?
Wende, the hard work always goes to the woman in the room, right?
You're still
Oops.
muted.
I
Sorry,
think
that's
okay. I think that is an organizing question. I think that when social orders collapse, there's a lot of space for people to take advantage of. And I think that that's one of the reasons we need to be very, very serious about solidarity economy work in struggling communities like that, because we need to be in the process of building something up that is democratic and collective, that doesn't exacerbate masculinist tendencies. So I think part of that is an organizing question. I really do. In North Central Philly, I work with a group called Stadium Stompers, who, by the way, forced Temple University to stand down from its plans to build a football stadium, further causing gentrification and displacement. We are in the process of considering a time bank and figuring out how to start slowly, but build that cooperative model in our community. So I guess part of what I think, Yusuf, is that those forces need to be batted back, not with more guns and bats and whatever, but with better organization and with examples of people meeting their needs in ways that are, you know, and not the gang process. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Thanks, Wendy.
That was profound enough for y'all.
You know, quite honestly, it's definitely the place where I would certainly want to go. I imagine too that if we had given you another half an hour, you would have built that out even more, but also gone to the other scales, the local, from the local to the regional and global, as you do in the book. So thank you very much. With that said, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Community Church of Boston, Shelton Solidarity, Socialism and Democracy, and Encuentro Cinco. We look forward to future conversations this month. We'll be talking, certainly by the end of the month, we'll be focusing on Earth Day with the science fiction writer Vandana Singh and our co-producer Mark Soderstrom. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the live stream now so that we can chat informally as if we were gathered in a single physical space.